Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be forging a leather punch, and if you're not familiar with this tool, it's basically a hammer-driven punch that cuts a circular hole in leather. There are basically two different designs for this type of punch. Today I'm going to be working on a relatively small punch, and next time I'll show you how to make punches for larger diameter holes or shapes. For the smaller punches, you can see here how the material has been cross-peened out and then wrapped around to form the barrel. At the top you can see where there's a gap, and that's because I didn't quite have enough material to get all the way around to form the tube. But that's okay, that isn't the working end of the tool. I was concentrating on the cutting edge, and that I believe is welded fairly well. I'm going to be forging the punch today out of a piece of crowbar, and this is basically just a 5/8 hex bar, and it's basically a spring steel. It's the equivalent of 5160. I have no idea specifically what this tool steel is, but I've always treated it like that, and it's worked fine. The first thing I'm going to do is create the offset that separates the handle from the barrel of the tool. Next I need to start cross-peening the material until I get the width that I need to make the barrel of the punch. Now that I have the main area flattened out, I'm going to start concentrating on one side of the punch at a time. I'm going to spread one side out, move to the other side, spread that out, and then work back and forth until I get the dimensions that I'm looking for. I'm not working from any particular measurements here, but I am keeping track of what I'm doing. So for example, when I've completed this punch, I'll be able to measure it, so I'll know what size hole it makes, and I'll also know where I started to get to that point. I also know that I've maxed out the amount of width that I can get out of this bar, so if I want to make a punch that's larger than this, I'm either going to need to upset some material to get more to work with or move to a larger bar. At this point I'm ready to start forming the barrel of the punch. There's nothing really too complicated about this process. You just have to take your time and make small changes to the bar. Once you've kinked it or hammered too much in one area, it can be quite difficult to get it back right. So it's easier to take more heats and just make sure that the shape develops gradually. If you don't have a swage, it's still possible to do this. You can just straighten it out later on once you have it welded by hammering it over a drift or something that has the shape that you're looking for. But if you do have a swage, it is a little easier to get the shape round if you're hammering into a round depression. And the final couple of heats, you're just trying to get that seam closed up as tight as you can possibly get it before welding. On the final heat, I'm taking it right down to a black heat. I'm not shaping any metal here. I'm basically just refining the surface and knocking off any scale. Before the bar cools off totally, I apply flux to the weld area. It's not hot enough to melt it, but there is enough melted on there to prevent any scale from forming as I heat it back up. And also when the flux is thick and fluffy like this, I usually place it above the fire to let the heat evaporate the rest of the water until it gets melted down into that, thick candy coating. If I try to shove it in the fire the way it is now, that white crusty coating is just going to fall off, and I'm going to lose 3/4 of my flux, and it's just going to melt in the fire and form clinkers. So I usually like to take a minute to make sure that it's melted down into that hard candy coating. At this point I can set it aside and I can go to work on the fire. I need to prep the fire to get it ready for welding. The first thing I like to do is take the poker and work around the fire and see what I have to work with. If I have a lot of hard packed coal, I usually break those up into lumps so that they'll burn a lot easier. After I have everything broken into lumps that I can use, I'm going to take the poker and rake through and make sure that I don't have any clinkers. So now I'm ready to start raking it all back into a pile, and then I can turn it into a welding fire once again. I'm going to start with a pretty heavy air blast. I'm not worried about burning any metal because I don't have it in there yet, but I need to reestablish the fire and I need to get everything really glowing white hot. So I'm going to give it lots of air and wait for that to happen. At this point I have a white hot fire again. I go around with my ladle, make sure that everything's tight, and I'm ready to put the metal into the fire. You can tell I have a good fire here because I haven't touched the blower in the last 15 or 20 seconds and I still have this white hot glowing mass in the center of the fire. So when I give it some air, it's really going to take off quickly. So the air blast at this point is really critical. I'm starting off with a fairly good blast because I want to reestablish that fire. The metal's cold, so I'm not worried about oxidizing the metal, but I need to get that furnace going. So I have a white hot fire. I've buried the steel. You have to have coal on top of your steel. If you can see the steel, there's a way for it to cool off and you're not going to get a welding heat. You need to bury that in the fire, have lots of coal underneath and a fair amount of coal on top, and you need to get everything white hot so it's this furnace that radiates that heat back into the steel. Because once the steel starts getting hot, you need to throttle back on your air blast. So you need that concentration of heat to drive into the metal. You can't supply air to it at this point because that'll cause it to burn. And now it's just a matter of being patient. You have to take your time, go easy on the air blast. You're supplying just enough to maintain that fire, and you wait for the heat to transfer into the bar. When that happens, the bar almost looks transparent. It becomes the same color as the fire, and there is no part of the bar that is any darker than the color of the fire. When that happens, the metal has reached the right consistency and the surfaces have become pliable enough that you're going to be able to hammer one face into the other face, and that's going to form your weld. And here I'm just setting the weld with some pretty light hammer blows. I'm working on both sides of the seam and just trying to mush the two surfaces together. I am doing my best to make a weld here, but in reality I really don't need to have this welded at all. As long as the surfaces are pushed together to a point where they become seamless, this tool will work just fine. Any kind of a weld that you do achieve is really just a bonus. So I'm making sure that I'm using the hottest part of the welding heat to work on the very end of the tool where the cutting edge is going to be. If the rest of it welds, that's great, but I'm not too concerned about that because that really doesn't form any function other than looking nice. So here I've jumped ahead in the process. I've done all the rough grinding that I needed to do to get the cutting edge pretty much shaped, and I've hardened it. So this is an oil hardening steel, so I heated it to a red heat, which is just above critical, and I quenched it in oil. And now I'm drawing the temper, and you can see the oil starting to burn off. The temper color that I'm looking for is kind of a reddy brown. It's just before it starts turning to a purple and a blue shade. That leaves a pretty good cutting edge, but it's still pretty impact resistance, so you can do a lot of hammering with it and it'll stand up to the abuse. You can see how the color just kind of looks like a bit of surface rust on it, but that's actually the oxidation color that I was looking for. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're planning on making a whole set of these, you can use what you've learned by making this one to either add or subtract what you need to get the other sizes that you're working on. Just keep track of what you're doing, and every additional one that you make is going to allow you to narrow in on that target that much easier. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting this channel, the simplest way, of course, is to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have questions and you want to contact me directly, you can do so by emailing me at either one of the addresses that I have listed here. It may take me a couple of days, but I will get back to you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.